Hello everyone. In this video I'm showing you how to get started with a new set of paints. I'm setting out a colour grid and trying a few other different things with my new paints. And then I show you how to get started with a first sketch based on the colour grid that you've created. In this video I'm using the Notes on Nature palette. I have a test palette here of some dots of the watercolours. The Notes on Nature palette, designed with nature journaling in mind, was created by KHannah in collaboration with Carrie Rogers. I was sent this to try and I'm just sharing that with you. This is a shortened version of a full 45-minute tutorial that's available on my Patreon. Right, so let's get into it. It's up to you whether you want to do this within your nature journal as a reference, or whether you want to do it on a separate piece of paper that you can put in the back of your journal, or whether you want to have it in a separate sketchbook. I have this particular sketchbook that I use for swatches and practice, so I'm going to put it into here. At first I'm just going to show you the approach that I take when I'm doing my colour charts. So this is for the Derwent Inktense set. Now this is a much larger set than I've got here with the KHannah paints. They are, I've only got 8 of these, so we're going to take a slightly different approach with the smaller paint set. The Inktense I had I think it was 48. I had a lot of colours to begin with. And I needed to break this down into colour areas, so I went for the greens and the yellows together, then I went for the reds and the browns together, and then finally pinks, purples and blues, just because I needed more space to really go through them. So on this side I'm just trying out the colour, and on this side I'm mixing the colours together. So you'll see here I've given each colour a little code, and then the intermixes of the colours, using this code, I can then look up and see what I get when I mix the two colours together. Similarly here, and finally over here. So that's trying to capture every single combination of colours. Another thing that can be quite useful to do is to practice a gradation with each colour. So you're going from the darkest possible that you can get right through to a white, just to see how the paint behaves. Every time I receive any new colours I do something similar. I have a little play around with them, and you can see I have done similar here for botanical ink, and also here when working with botanical inks and some of my own inks as well. Okay, so for my 8 colours I thought it would be easier to do a simple grid. It doesn't have to be perfect, but having a ruler does help, because otherwise it can get a little bit wobbly. You can be very careful if you want to and measure it all out to the millimetre and have it perfect, but it's not going to make any difference to what you're actually trying to do, so there's not really much point in taking the time to do that if you don't want to. Okay, so now we've got a 4x4. Now we want to turn this into 8x8. Finally, I'm just going to darken up the edge of the box. So now we've got an 8x8 grid. So I'm just going to write along the top what the paint is. So this is in my fine liner now. So now along the top, I want to put a little bit of each colour. Fill this box up. Try and get an even grade of colour as much as you can. I know that sometimes can be quite difficult. These paints are interesting here because some are more opaque than others. This pink is quite a strong opaque colour, whereas the one beforehand, which was columbine, wasn't. So that's the sort of thing that you can make a few notes on as well. So in each case we're just trying to fill the box with as uniform colour as possible. I'm not wetting the paper at all beforehand because I want to make sure that the paint is kept tightly within each of the boxes. I don't want them to mix together until I deliberately do that myself. I don't want them to bleed across into the other boxes. a nice, fairly neutral green. We've got wonderful, vibrant yellow. And then we've got some pinks and purples, which can be quite awkward to mix. This colour, Blackbird's Egg, is quite strong and opaque. So these are all the sorts of things that you, when you first play with your new paints, you can start to notice about them, how they vary. So now we want to, along the top, write down what we've got. So these are our paint names. Now mix these two colours together. So imagine that these ones are going down in a column this way. So this is Columbine by itself. Next we want Columbine mixed with Dog Rose, which we're going to put here. So we're going to put a little of each onto the palette and clean the brush between each. And you see now we start to see how such a small set can really expand out into quite an interesting range of colours now. Okay, so I'm just going to go on and do all of the rest of those in the same way. And I'll just speed up the videos because it's not going to be very exciting to watch with me doing this over and over again. And then we'll come back when the complete grid has been made. Remember that this is a shortened version of a much longer tutorial that's available on my Patreon. So if you want a lot more details on what you've just seen with the mixing grid, then you know where to go find it. Here are the test pages finally done. So you can see that I've used the fine liner to outline the main part of the grid. Here's the mistake that I made using the same colour twice at the top. So I've just outlined around the area where I've done all the mixing, so it's easy to find and see that. I've also added the codes in because I think it would be quite useful to have the codes for this part of the page. Over here I picked the interesting colours that I outlined and did a gradient between the two. So we've got here, for example, the Dog Rose through to the Dioxin Yellow, and you can see how these colours merge together through a lovely range of peaches here. Finally here I've got the transparency tests. So with this one I've put as much paint as I possibly can on this side and gradually water it down until I get to the colour of the paper below. And some paints are easier to do this with than others. Some of these boxes are more successful than others. And that can help you to know that, because these are ones you could perhaps try practicing again. Perhaps in some of these empty boxes over here I might do that. So now I've got all of this test materials, it's time to really get on and have a go at actually painting with my new paints. I'm going to get on with a sketch of some nice pale pink roses that match well with this particular palette. And I'll just show you how to use the grid with a first little painting. So first of all, I'm going to begin on the nice yellow centres of the flowers. And I really like this particular column with the pink. I think that's going to slightly dull down that bright yellow, as you can see in the colour mixing grid. So just adding a little bit of that to bring that yellow back out from that vibrant, quite garish kind of colour. And just adding that to each of them. These, you know, I like to try and always use the colour everywhere that it appears in the picture, just making things a little bit more efficient. And this is really an exercise in familiarity with this new palette. Right, next up I'm interested in getting the dark areas between the leaves. And to do that I want to get some of the darkest colours that I can see in my mixing grid. Now, I really like this one, the burnt umber mixed with the alkanet. So it's a burnt umber with a kind of a sort of cerulean powdery kind of blue, and I'm just adding a touch of green to it. One of the strengths of this palette is the nice pastel sort of hues that you're getting, and I want to keep that. And now going in all of these areas kind of around where the leaves are, that's where I'm adding this colour, and just getting in all of those gaps nicely. Now going to go for the leaves, the lightest area in the leaves, and we're going to use this wonderful spring green mixed with the bright yellow. This creates a kind of really beautiful, vibrant, early spring green. Just picking out a few areas that I'd like to be a little bit lighter on the leaves, and doing that across all of the leaves in the entire picture. And just keeping on going round, usually sticking a little bit towards the edges of the leaves rather than the middles for this sort of embellishment highlight. And going round onto this second page. Start to notice that as you add more, really making sure that there's some good coverage of this, because I want it to be across all of the areas of leaf, not just a few of them. Now we are lacking a bright red in this palette, so because we don't have a bright red, we've got to look at the colour grid and we've got to say, okay, what is the reddest tone that we have in this palette? And that is very much that potter's pink, that colour. So in the absence of a bright red, I'm going to use this, and when you look at it, or when the viewer looks at it, because it is the reddest tone on the page, it will stand out as looking a little bit more red than it perhaps actually is. I think at that point I decided that actually I wanted to get the pink of those flower petals going, because that's the main dominant colour, that's the main part of this picture really, is these great big beautiful pink flowers. So getting that colour on now is a good idea. Now to get some areas of shadow or slightly darker areas onto these petals, I'm adding a bit of that reddish pink in again, which again we don't have a fluorescent pink in this palette, and I'm not going to go to another palette to find it. I'm just using my grid and the colours that I've got available to try and bring something close to that. You can see there that this purple that's come from the ink underneath is starting to show through a little bit on the flower, and it's adding a slightly cool area that looks a bit like a shadow. But I want this to happen. I've got this painting over here, just this little bit of yellow, and this is one of the perks of painting on these stained pages in the first place, so I don't want to get rid of that. I just have to embrace it. One at the top, this one's got a lot more petals that are curling over, so there's a lot more of this darker colour in this one. How I'm going to mix the green for the leaves, so we're going with the spring green and this blackbird's egg. This is the closest colour that's on that grid, so it's the closest pair. This is how we're using this grid. We're looking at pairs of colours and how they can be slightly augmented. Now I'm adding a little bit of yellow. What I want to do is I want to bring it away from that very bluish green and into a slightly more neutral green that's got a more equal amount of blue and yellow. So using the grid of the two colours as a starting point, and then mixing away from that by adding a third colour or a fourth colour. Having the grid available takes some of that step away, so you're not constantly having to battle with adding lots of different colours and trying to find a shade. It's enough to look for the pairs and then work away from that. Now here's the final journal page after adding a few more details to the roses, all built up from the sketch that I showed you earlier and looking at this colour grid. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe, and look at the description below for more painting videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.